The Jets still don't quite have their head coach, but they almost do, and I think it's going to happen really soon. Let's break down the latest developments in the Jets coaching search today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, January 22nd, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangrenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you, everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday, and today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. And right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Well, we have our weekly mailbag today. We will get to that. But first, let's start by talking about the latest developments in the Jets' search for a new head coach and a new general manager. As we left off yesterday, Aaron Glenn and Lance Newmark were the first candidates to get second interviews with the Jets. Glenn is the candidate for head coach and viewed as the leader in the clubhouse right now. Newmark is currently the leading candidate for general manager, and both of them left the team facility yesterday. So there was talk. Ian Rappaport of NFL Network said at the start of the day that the Jets' objective was for Glenn to stay there all day and for the Jets to work out a new deal. In fact, if you were following the proceedings yesterday, it felt like Aaron Glenn was interviewing the Jets more than the Jets were interviewing Aaron Glenn. It seems like Glenn is clearly the Jets' number one choice at this point. And reports indicate from yesterday that the Jets have made him an offer to be their next head coach. And the word that was used in a couple of the reports was a substantial offer. So the Jets are stepping up to the plate. Clearly, the Jets really want Aaron Glenn to be head coach. But there's a lot of trepidation in the fan base because Glenn left the facility yesterday. And, in situations like this, there's a phrase that gets used all the time, whether we're talking about coaching candidates, whether we're talking about GM candidates, whether, even in free agency, there's a phrase that's used, don't let him leave the building. And I always kind of laugh at this statement. I always kind of roll my eyes at this phrase because you can't force a grown man to stay in the building. This is what, do you want it to be like that episode of The Office where Michael Scott forces the pizza delivery guy to stay in the office? There's nothing you can do. You can't lock Aaron Glenn in a room because Glenn did not complete things yesterday, because Glenn did not officially agree to become the Jets head coach. There's a lot of trepidation in the fan base. But I think in a high stress situation like this, it's easy to kind of lose perspective. And I think about how I would want to handle things in a situation like this if I was Aaron Glenn. Aaron Glenn is about to make a decision that will change his life. He's about to make maybe the most important decision he'll make in his career, because you may only get one shot at being a head coach. So the team you pick is critically important. In a decision this important, in a decision where your career is riding in the balance, I would want to sleep on it. Even if I was dead set on going to the Jets, I would leave the building. I wouldn't sign a contract until I slept on it. And even if I really felt like the Jets were the right fit for me, I just want to take some time and think it through. And I think that's a very logical thing for Aaron Glenn to do. But of course, if the coach leaves the building, everybody acts like it's not going to happen. Well, all you have to do is go back 4 years. In January of 2021, there was a lot of trepidation in the Jets fan base because Robert Saleh left the building. The Jets were interviewing Saleh. He actually had an interview scheduled with the Philadelphia Eagles. And then shortly after that, Saleh agreed to become the Jets head coach. Now, maybe you wish he hadn't, but that's a story that tells you how these things really work. That a coach leaving the facility without a deal in place, that doesn't mean that he's going to go somewhere else. Right now, I think the smart money is on Aaron Glenn becoming the Jets head coach. And look, this is a podcast episode that will probably have a very short shelf life. Sometimes we do episodes where we talk about the team in broad terms. It's the type of thing that even years later it applies. Then we have episodes where it only lasts for a couple hours. This this is probably going to be a podcast episode that only lasts for a couple hours, because I think there's a very good chance that by the end of the day today, Aaron Glenn is the next Jets head coach. And all of the reports suggest that, even though Glenn left the facility, there's not really a lot of concern with the Jets at this moment. Now, Glenn does have an interview scheduled today with the New Orleans Saints. So it's something to watch. And until the ink is dry on a contract, it's always possible that things could change. It's always possible that things could go wrong. Glenn is not a lock to go to the Jets. But the idea that because Glenn left the building, now the Jets are in big trouble. Now the Jets aren't going to get him. Well, it's not necessarily true, because the Saleh case shows us that, sometimes a coach just wants to take some time to think it over. But it's also not true, because all of the reports suggest that the Jets are very confident Glenn's going to take the offer. The Jets apparently are making a very aggressive offer for Aaron Glenn to be their next head coach. And it really feels like this is all about Glenn, because it sounds like the Jets are very willing to pair him with Newmark, who Glenn worked with for 3 years in Detroit. It sounds like this is going to be like everything's going to be built around Aaron Glenn. He's going to have the GM of his choice, which is not something the New Orleans Saints can offer him at this point. And there's a lot of trepidation about that, because there's this perception out there that every team in the league, they choose the GM first, and the GM then chooses the head coach. But that's not true. We've been over this the last couple of days. It's not even true in cases where you have a first-time head coach. In 2017, when the San Francisco 49ers hired Kyle Shanahan, he's the guy that brought in John Lynch as their GM. When the Buffalo Bills hired Sean McDermott, they had Doug Whaley as their GM, but Whaley was kind of on his way out. He kind of helped them through that last offseason, or the first offseason with McDermott. But the Bills had their eyes on bringing in Brandon Beane, who was paired with McDermott. Beane and McDermott both came from the Carolina Panthers. So the big thing for me is that the coach and the GM are aligned. It's not about who hires who. It's not about the order that they're hired in. It's just about them being on the same page. It's about Glenn, the head coach, who in this case would be Glenn, being able to communicate the types of players he wants at each position, and the GM, who would be Newmark, being able to execute his wishes and find quality prospects. We see this work across the league. There are lots of different models of head coaching and general managing. There are lots of different models of how the organizational flow chart works. It's not the case with every single team that the head coach reports to the GM. There are very successful organizations where the head coach is more in power. And it seems like with the Jets, that's kind of the model they're going to. My big concern is just making sure Woody Johnson has as little power as possible. And Woody Johnson increases his power in situations where the GM and the head coach aren't on the same page. So that, to me, is the thing you want to avoid. Outside of that, I'm not overly concerned with it. I think that if you hire the coach first, you want a GM who's on the same page with him. Because one thing that we've seen over and over in this league is that a strong head coach model can work. A strong GM model can work. What doesn't work, and what we've seen with the Jets in many instances, is when the GM and the coach just aren't on the same page, because that's when the Johnson brothers step in, because the Johnson brothers then get to break the tie, and we don't want the Johnson brothers anywhere near this. So a lot going on right now. I think in situations like this, it's always better to keep calm. I think it's always best to avoid panic. I think that just because Glenn left the facility yesterday, that does not mean he will definitely be passing on the Jets job. It sounds like he's very interested. So I would not be surprised if we had a major development today. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll go back in the past a little bit. There was a top tier candidate who could have been available to the Jets. Would he have been available if they had moved faster? I'm not so sure about that, and I'll explain why as we continue here on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting, because right now new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. That's $300 to keep the action going. The FanDuel app is easy to navigate, and the variety of bets keeps every game exciting. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. No waiting around for your winnings, whether you're betting on your favorite team or just looking to add some extra excitement to the playoffs. FanDuel has you covered. Of course, we have 2 championship games coming up this weekend. We have the Washington Commanders at the Philadelphia Eagles. We have the Buffalo Bills at the Kansas City Chiefs. Both of them figure to be very good games, very exciting games. FanDuel's the place to get in on the action. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today, and you'll get started with $300 in bonus bets at FanDuel.com. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the National Football League. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Now let's move on to our weekly mailbag. Each Wednesday, we try and do a mailbag with listener questions. Our first question is from Chris. John, I'm wondering if you think the Jets would have been able to get Mike Vrabel if they had moved quicker. I feel like that the biggest advantage of letting Saleh and Douglas go early is that the Jets should have had a head start on the other teams. Let's say they had fulfilled the Rooney Rule requirements by the time Vrabel had become available and before the Pats had fired Mayo. Could they have closed the deal? It seems like it at least has to be a possibility. If he's not the guy, it's one thing. But if he was the best possible choice, could we have lost that chance due to poor execution? Am I wrong for being frustrated on that? Well, Chris, I think I have credibility on this issue. I'm not one to pull punches on the Jets, and I think that in many ways, the Jets have gone out of their way to make this job very unattractive based on the way they've handled things over the last couple of years. But when it comes to Mike Vrabel, I'm not going to get on the Jets for that. When we talk about the Jets having a head start, I don't think it's as big of an advantage as people make it out to be. Because you have to remember, you were not allowed to speak with candidates before the season ended if they were employed by an NFL team. And Mike Vrabel was employed by the Cleveland Browns for most of this season. Now, the Browns actually let Vrabel out of his contract a week early. They kind of did him a favor because the Browns season was ending anyway. The Browns weren't making the playoffs. So they kind of did him a solid. They let him out. And the Jets were able to interview Vrabel before the end of the regular season. But it was just a couple of days before the end of the regular season. And by that point, it was clear that New England was possibly making a move. Now, I don't think it was not a lock. It was not a sure thing. But at that point, Vrabel had to have known that it was a possibility, that it conceivably could have happened. And look, I think the Jets were always going to have a tough time going up against New England because New England was the team where he spent the best years of his career with. And he has a very close relationship with that owner, Robert Kraft. So you can get on the Jets for a lot of things. And there are many instances where you can say the Jets have made this job unattractive. And that's why they haven't been able to interview Ben Johnson, who is widely viewed as the top candidate of this cycle. That might be why they haven't been able to interview Mike McCarthy or Todd Monken. There's nothing beneficial about that. The Jets haven't shown a lot of interest in those guys. But it's possible those guys aren't interested because the Jets have gone out of their way to make this job unattractive. But when it comes to Mike Vrabel, that's a spot where I have a tough time getting on the Jets because – and this is just an educated guess. Like, I'm not giving you any insider information on this, but my read on the situation is that, and this was my read on the situation the whole time with Vrabel, is that if that New England job did not open, I think Vrabel would be the head coach of the Jets because the Jets were the fact the Jets had the GM job open, and this might be something that plays out when they negotiate with Aaron Glenn. The fact they have the GM job open is an advantage because especially if you want to coach, because you can tell the coach, we'll pick a GM who's compatible with you. You're not going to have to work with the GM that we already have. I think that that's an advantage. And I think that once the New England job opened up, it was pretty much over. I think you want to get on Woody for, again, Ben Johnson. You can, because this has been an unattractive job for a coach like Ben Johnson. And a lot of that goes to Woody. Even if you want to get on Woody for McCarthy or Monken, I can buy that. A lot of the top candidates in this cycle the Jets have not interviewed. But when it comes to Vrabel, just tough to get on him because, Vrabel has the ties with New England. Vrabel was part of the glory years. Vrabel was there during the Brady years. Those were the best seasons he played as a player. And he has a tie, he has ties with Robert Kraft. Now, you want to say Woody Johnson, when the choice is Robert Kraft versus Woody Johnson, everybody's going to choose Robert Kraft. Well, I can't argue with that. And you're right about that. So I get on Woody from that standpoint, that's fine. But Jets couldn't move quicker. If the Jets had an opportunity to interview Vrabel in October, then yeah, I can see what you're saying. They had an opportunity to interview him in November. I can see what you're saying. But they only really had the opportunity to interview him a couple of days before the season ended. And by that point, it was clear that it wasn't clear that the Patriots were firing Gerard Mayo, but it was clear that that was a possibility. It was clear that very well might happen. So it's tough for me to get on the Jets. And again, like I don't pull punches when I think the Jets are wrong. I don't pull punches when the Jets do stuff that makes their jobs unattractive. But I can't really blame Woody on this one. I can't really blame the Jets because, again, like Vrabel, by all accounts, I mean, it was people close to Vrabel said he was interested in the job. It's just a better job opened up, and it goes, it even goes beyond the relationship Vrabel has with Kraft. Patriots have the most cap space in the league this offseason, and they have a young quarterback who people think are promising. Jets have a bad cap situation, and they don't have a quarterback. So I think that it's just a tough spot. Now, again, you want to blame the Jets for getting into the situation where they're not an attractive job. You're right about that. It's tough to argue. Next question. John, assuming things progress with Glenn and Newmark, what would you say about the Jets trying to trade for Herndon Hooker as a depth quarterback? Newmark and Glenn should know him well from Detroit, and he looks solid in limited action. What are your thoughts? I wouldn't bring him in to be the starter. If this is a quarterback he's kind of a project quarterback who's been with Detroit the last couple of years. He really hasn't played that much, so it's difficult to have a read on him. I think that Glenn, as you mentioned, Glenn and Newmark know the guy, so if they think he's got potential, I mean, I wouldn't. I couldn't argue with them making a low cost move to acquire him. But I mean, in no way would I bring him in to be the starting quarterback. I'd bring him in to maybe compete with Jordan Travis for who are project quarterbacks going to be going forward. This is not a guy you can bet on to be the starting quarterback of this team in 2025. I always think you should have a development quarterback on your team. I think that's just good roster management because even though the odds of hitting on a young developmental quarterback are low, the rewards are so great that you should try it, even though it's not going to work out. So, look, I have no objection to that. I think it would be fine. I think it would be a perfectly plausible move for the Jets. But he's not somebody I watch and I say, wow, that Jets got to get this guy. It's more, if the new coaching staff is comfortable with him, if the new coaching staff likes his tools, then yeah, fine, give him a shot. But I can't say that's one I feel super passionately about. Next question. If Glenn comes in as head coach, who would you want for his offensive coordinator? That's a tough question to answer, and maybe this is not going to be a great answer, but I'll tell you the qualities I'm looking for. First of all, I'm looking for somebody who runs a modern offense, somebody who's not run first, second, and third, somebody who wants to utilize the passing game, somebody who is willing to utilize the run-pass option, somebody who's trying to be on the cutting edge with formation, stacking receivers, using motion to get an advantage, things along those lines. And the second important quality is I want them to work well with Glenn. I think sometimes we view these coaching staffs as though it's like fantasy football, where you could just pair these people as a head coach looks good and an offensive coordinator looks good and the defensive coordinator looks good. But in reality, these guys need to be able to work together. Personalities need to mesh. When you're building a coaching staff, it's kind of like building a team. And when you put together a roster, the most talented players don't always make the best mix. You need people who complement each other. You need people who work well together. I think the same is very much true of a coaching staff. So, without knowing who Glenn works well with, it's difficult to say. But those are the traits that I'd like, and I think that those are very important traits for the New York Jets to have. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to a player the Jets are going to have to make a big decision on this offseason. Is there any way for this team to keep Davante Adams? I would not get my hopes up, and I'll explain why as we continue here on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Talkspace. Therapy is a game changer. It can help manage stress, improve sleep, and communicate more effectively. But finding the right therapist and fitting sessions into a busy schedule can be a challenge. That's where Talkspace comes in. Talkspace, the leading virtual therapy provider, makes getting the help you need easy, accessible, and affordable. With Talkspace, signing up is simple. You can match with a licensed therapist who fits your needs, usually within 48 hours. And it's convenient. You can have sessions from the comfort of your own home and even message your therapist between appointments. Plus, Talkspace is covered by many insurance plans, and for most insured members, it's a $0 copay. It's never been easier to prioritize mental health. As a listener of this podcast, you'll get $80 off your first month with Talkspace when you go to Talkspace.com/LockedOnNFL and enter promo code SPACE80. To match with a licensed therapist today, go to Talkspace.com/LockedOnNFL and enter promo code SPACE80. That's SPACE number 8, number 0, one word, no space, to get $80 off your first month and show your support for the show. That's Talkspace.com/LockedOnNFL, promo code space80. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. On this Wednesday, we're doing our weekly mailbag show. Our next question: should the Jets keep both Rodgers and Adams? For what it's worth, I would renegotiate Adams' contract with or without Rodgers. Rodgers is a pretty easy decision for me because he just wasn't that good this year. I think like one of the things that gets lost is that Aaron Rodgers was just a pretty ineffective quarterback. The Jets offense really struggled. And I mean, it's pretty clear their offensive line did pretty well in pass protection. You had, for most of the season, the Davante Adams, Garrett Wilson 1-2 punch at the receiver position. I actually think like maybe Rodgers' struggles get underrated because like the national media is so hesitant to criticize him. And that's one of the funny things about Aaron Rodgers is Aaron Rodgers like has this persona that he wants you to believe that like he's the most criticized player in the league when like he's very seldom criticized. People like the analysts in this league like really go out of their way to not criticize him. I mean, I can't count how many times this year where he's like barely outrunning a 300-pound lineman, and the analyst on the game is saying, "Wow, Rodgers looks so mobile," or Rodgers, kind of throws a duck up there, and the analyst says his arm. You can see his arm as good as anything. I mean, there's so many instances where like the people on TV are like telling you something that's like at 180 degrees with what you're seeing with your own eyes. Really tough to and beyond everything else, you're adding another $37.5 million to the cap. This will take Rodgers' dead money hit if he retires after 2025 to over $60 million in 2026. It's just a non-starter, and that doesn't even go into how the Jets have built this thing around him the last 2 years, and it's completely failed. I think they need to move on. Adams is also a guy the Jets need to move on from. He's still a good player. He's still producing at a high level. But there's just no way this player makes sense for the Jets. I mean, the question said, well, I tried to renegotiate Adams. And that's great in theory. Look, there's a price where Davante Adams makes sense for the Jets next year because he can still play at a high level. And I think the Jets kind of figured something out with Adams. If you looked at his production this year, he had a higher share of his production from the slot than he has at any point, than he did at any point in his prime. It feels like Davante probably should have like a Larry Fitzgerald-esque late career transition to the slot where he can feast on good matchups, where he can use his smarts and his route running to get open, because in those situations, he can still be effective. But you just hear from behind the scenes, and it's not just what you hear from behind the scenes; it's what what you see with your own eyes. It's what you hear with your own ears. Adams has been pretty clear that he only wants to play with Rodgers, and that's why he forced his way out of the Raiders. And there have been reports behind the scenes that Adams made sure that he was in control of his own destiny. He did not rework his deal, which essentially gives him all the leverage because he cannot come back on his current salary number in 2025. So he'll need to be willing to renegotiate his deal. If Rodgers doesn't come back, he's not going to be really willing to renegotiate his deal. Again, a guy who's still a good player, a guy who's still a very effective player, but a guy who really doesn't make sense for a team like the Jets because I don't think he's going to be willing to come back at a lower number. Look, if he was willing to cut his salary in half, then that would probably make sense for the Jets. But I don't think he's going to do it unless Rodgers is here. So his current cap number is just crazy. And the Jets cannot bring him back at that. So I think that it's probably time to move on from Adams. Rodgers is obvious. Adams, like in the theoretical world where Adams is willing to play ball and renegotiate his deal, fine, you could bring him back, but he's not going to be willing to do that. I mean, he's made it clear. Again, he forced his way off a team to get with Rodgers. So now just let Rodgers go and Adams could be fine coming back at a lower number. I'll believe it when I see it. I don't think that's going to happen. I think in many ways the Jets would be well advised to just move on. Next question. I have a pretty random one. As far as I can tell, Mike McCagnon and Adam Gase are out of football. Any idea what they're up to? The last I heard, McCagnon had become an agent. That was a while back, but that was my understanding. And Gase, from what I understand, is working with Peyton Manning's production company. Peyton Manning does a lot of media work now. He has his own production company. My understanding is Gase is some sort of consultant to that. Now, there was this one tweet a few years back. It was a satire tweet that caught on like crazy, and people ran with it. People actually thought it was true. There's some tweet that Adam Gase was coaching high school football as an offensive coordinator, And that tweet was not accurate. It was a joke. Like the guy that posted it was joking around, and this thing caught on, and like everybody thought Adam Gase was an offensive coordinator in high school. That's not the case. These guys haven't really publicized what they're doing at this point, but that's the last we heard. Maccagnan was an agent, and Gase is working with Peyton Manning's production company. Now, whether that's still the case, I'm not entirely sure, because again, these guys don't have big time jobs. They're not going to have big time jobs again. But that's that's the last we heard of these guys. So if you're interested in what happened to the Maccagnan Gase duo, that's what happened. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out. It helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.